to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
Hello, all Antiochian men in the Diocese of Miami in the Southeast. This is Michael Bocklig once again, and we are back with another in our Ask Father Hans series. Father Hans, thanks for joining us and good morning.
Good morning, Michael, and good morning, Antiochian men.
Here's our next question, Father. You have quoted Alexander Solzhenitsyn several times before. What parallels do you see between Soviet Russia and what we are living through right now in this country?
A lot, actually, a lot. For those in the audience who don't know who Alexander Solzhenitsyn is, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Russian dissident. So he was active during communism, before communism fell. And he was, like a lot of his peers, a Marxist. He bought the party line when he was young. Now, he knew a little bit about his orthodoxy, but orthodoxy was suppressed in Russia. Although he writes that as a child, he remembers being hoisted on the shoulders of a taller man, and he could see the liturgy. But Christianity was horribly suppressed. Orthodox Christianity was horribly suppressed in Russia for different reasons, but one of them is that Marxist materialism, the idea that only matter exists. We're no more than our bodies. There's no, and I'm borrowing from Solzhenitsyn here, his language, there's no transcendent touchstone above man, no authority outside of man, that none of that exists. And of course, it unleashed just the Marxist horrors and the bloodshed. And Solzhenitsyn says 60 million dead following that hideous ideology. But he was a kind of casual Marxist, and he fought in World War II, and he wrote a letter critical of Stalin, and he got arrested. And he got arrested, why? Because he dared criticize the prevailing orthodoxy, small o, right? And it was a threat. Independence and free thinking was a threat to the regime. They threw him in jail. Jail was a real hard time for him. And in a way, this experience parallels Dostoevsky, who wrote about the coming darkness in which Solzhenitsyn lived 50 years before. In prison, he has the insight. He starts seeking God again, and he has this insight that shaped the rest of his life, that evil does not lie in institutions and structures outside of man, that the dividing line between good and evil lies in man's heart. And depending on where that line is, how the man lives and acts determines what those cultural structures, the institutions become. So the only way, when darkness is in the world, like the darkness of communism, the Marxist ideology, it's responsible for just the worst brutality that history has seen, the scale of brutality. More Christians died in the last century for their faith than all the centuries leading up to the last century. We don't realize that. And a lot of it happened in Russia because the Marxist ideology, being materialist, hates religion, because religion claims that only God is the judge, not the state. So he has this insight, and it brings him deep into communion with God, self-reflection, and the man changes. He gets released from prison finally, and he starts writing a history of the Soviet Union. and they were called the Gulag Archipelago. Okay, so Marxism, the Marxist Soviet state, in order to enforce its orthodoxy, anybody who dared challenge the orthodoxy would be put into these prison camps called gulags. And these gulags were spread out all across Russia, a lot like Hitler's concentration camps spread out all over the areas that he conquered. And he started to chronicle the history of the gulags based on his experience in them in one of the prison camps. And he wrote them all in secret. And it's a great dramatic story of how he had to hide, he had to flee from the police at times, that type of thing. What happened was they get smuggled out of Russia and they get published in the West. And they caused a furor because it was the first history of the Soviet Union written by somebody who actually lived through it. And it was so powerful, the publication of those books were so powerful that they decimated the Marxist intellectual establishment of Western Europe. They also laid the intellectual groundwork in the United States so that for the coming of Reagan, so when Reagan became president, and in concert with Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul, were able to defeat the Soviet regime without a shot being fired. They essentially bankrupted them, is what happened. And communism fell. The sea change occurred in people's hearts and in people's thinking. And what caused that change was the publication of the gulags. So my story with Solzhenitsyn is I watched this unfold. And he gave an address at Harvard called the Harvard Address, and he gave it in 1976. And I happened to stumble across that when I was a college student. I just found it in the library. It was in the stacks. And I knew who he was, but I wasn't as familiar with him as I am now, of course. But I read that, and I realized that this was the spiritual depth I was searching for. I was really searching. I mean, coming out of my own matrix at the time. And I read this and I went, this is real religion. This is real religion. And it was the depth I needed. I needed real religion. And that's what introduced orthodoxy to me. I didn't even know what orthodoxy was until then. And that's when I started kind of researching orthodoxy on my own. So for that reason, he's very close to me. I quote him a lot because in his struggles, he teaches us some fundamental things about truth. And this is really drawn from the Gospels. And now subsequently, having read Dostoevsky, I see where he drew it from, okay? That in the struggle against darkness, the only thing that can banish darkness is light, because darkness is fundamentally a lie. It's fundamentally a lie, and once a lie is exposed, then it loses its power. The publication of the gulags in the West exposed the lie of the Marxist, exposed the Marxist lie. And that lie took on a mythological dimension in the minds of academics in the West. They were seduced by it. But the gulags revealed what was really going on, and that's why the intellectual establishment in Western Europe collapsed. This man and his courage, one word of truth will outweigh the world, is one of his phrases. He has many beautiful ones, but that's one of my favorites. One word of truth will outweigh the world reminds us of what the power of how powerful a word spoken in truth really is, and that we as Christians must live in the truth, and in order to live in the truth, we must speak truth. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is called, to tear down, the Marxist establishment of wherever it might happen to me. I mean, that's a really Only few people can do that. But we are called to live truth, and more importantly, speak truth, because if we speak truth, we'll live truth. If we live truth, we'll speak truth in our corner of the world. You know, there's sometimes when you simply cannot compromise. And because what the compromise will do is bring harm to your own soul. At the same time, and this is the difficulty of it, but this is what Christ says, that speaking the truth will also impose a cost. And in our culture, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that we are entering an age similar to what Solzhenitsyn lived in, and also what the early Christians in the first 3 centuries faced. Now, if we want to understand this, read Dostoevsky, because as I said, you know, I entered that world through Solzhenitsyn, and then I read Dostoevsky, and I realized where Solzhenitsyn was drawing his ideas from and where a lot of his awareness came. Dostoevsky warned of the coming darkness, and he was trying to warn the Russians of it, of the coming darkness 50 years before it happened. And he could see it coming because he was grounded very well in his Orthodox faith. The Orthodox faith, because it is reality. All the things we talk about, the self-discipline, conforming ourselves to Christ, we are created to live in and with God. We're not complete unless we're in communion with God. All those things, if we practice them, also give us a clarity of mind where we can see reality as it is. And we can see the darkness encroaching. That's what Dostoevsky saw. And he was able to see the darkness, but also comprehend its nature. And what if it was not defeated? What would ensue in his society if it won? Well, he was right. And it was a horrible darkness, and it lasted for 68 years until it met resolute resistance on the West. Okay, Thatcher, Pope John Paul, and Ronald Reagan, but also spiritually collapsed. It spiritually collapsed on the inside Russia. But this was 68 years of abject suffering. We don't wish this. We don't want this, all right? And we have to stand up against this. But we can see it and we can understand it. And so, yes, I would say, to answer the question, this is getting a little longer. Yes, I see parallels between what's happening in the Western Christendom now, which is Western Europe and the United States. It has parallels to what happened to Eastern Christendom, primarily Russia. And the broad parallel is this, is that the materialism, the denial of God that led to the darkness in the Soviet Union, it's the same materialism and it's the same denial of God that is now operative in the West. If anyone desires, they should actually read Solzhenitsyn's Harvard Address of 1976. You can either Google in Harvard Address, Solzhenitsyn Harvard Address, or Solzhenitsyn Warning to the West, because in 76, he warned us that this is exactly what will happen. He warned us. He was a hero up to that speech. After that speech, he became a pariah in the West. No more interviews. He was basically a recluse up in northern Vermont until communism fell and he was welcomed back to his home country. But the warnings are prescient. The warnings are real. And we need to take heed to them because there is a darkness that is encroaching the free world. In fact, it's already established in some of our institutions and so on and so forth. I don't want to be an alarmist, but I do want to be a realist. So I think looking back to that period can give us warning, but also teach us how to fight, how to prepare if need be. It should not instill fear, but what it should do is instill a deeper resolve, because in the end, the Lord is King.
Open to me the doors of repentance, O life giver, for my soul goes early to the temple of thy holiness, coming in the temple of my body, O